Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Mimomax Project Management webinar. This is the first webinar in a two-part series, which is meant to provide an overview of a field area network, or FAN, deployment. In part one, we will be covering the project charter, initiating and planning a FAN project. My name is Mike Russell, and I will be your host today. I have over 30 years of experience in the telecommunications industry, and I have held several positions ranging from technician to market manager. I began my telecommunications career in the United States Navy, working on the communications, navigation, and electronic warfare systems of the F-14 Tomcat. I progressed my knowledge base by working with general contractors, network operators, technology innovators, and equipment manufacturers on the construction and deployment of cellular, fiber optic, and other types of communications networks. I have been with Mimomax for the past 3.5 years as a project manager. I work with our key partners to facilitate the deployment of their field area networks across the country. I also work with our research and development team to bring new products and features to market. I am pleased to have you with us today and hope that this presentation provides some useful insights into the fascinating world of field area networks. At this time, I would like to introduce Fabian Dellen, the General Manager of our Client Services Division here at Mimomax. Fabian?
Yeah, Mike, thank you very much for the introduction. I just got a message through that I think people are joining at the moment, so we'll hold another minute or so just to ensure that everybody who is joining at the moment is there before we proceed. But yeah, so hold for everybody. Just if we can hold for one more minute, that would be appreciated, and then we'll continue with the presentation.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. Well, while we're waiting for others to join, typically it's a habit of ours here at Mimomax to start off any project meeting with a safety minute. I will say that here in Arizona, we've been getting a lot of rain lately. This is our wettest monsoon that we've had in the past 14 years. Here in Phoenix, we've had, I think, somewhere between 3 and 6 inches of rain, depending on where you are in the metro area. And down in Tucson, they've had over 12 inches of rain. Mount Lemmon and some of the other surrounding mountains have received over 2 inches. Here in the desert, heavy rains do cause flash floods. We have had several fatalities due to the flash floods. So be cognizant of where you're at and your surroundings and what you're doing, as flash floods can occur quite rapidly, even if where you're at there is little to no rain. If you happen to be in the west, please be careful. We still have a lot of forest fires raging throughout the west and Pacific Northwest. And if you happen to be in the east or southeast right now, the tropical storm has come through and dumped a lot of rain, which has also caused a lot of flooding. So be cognizant of where you're at. If you're traveling, keep an eye on the weather and the environmental conditions of the place that you happen to be visiting.
Thank you for that safety minute, Mike. That's really appreciated. It looks like that everybody who wanted to join has joined now, so we will proceed with the presentation. So yeah, thank Mike for that introduction. As Mike said, my name is Fabian Dillon. I am the GM Client Services at Mimomax and responsible for our external facing services provided to our existing, new, and potential partners. The services include support, coverage design, project management, training, but yeah, a number of others as well. As Mike mentioned before, Mimomax offers more than just equipment. We are constantly assessing the services needs from our customers to ensure that they are successful in the deploying, supporting, and the managing of their radio links and FAN networks. So in today's webinar, we would like to share with you our project management focused experience. around the rollout of fan networks, and we hope that will help you in getting an insight in what's all involved in project managing a fan network. If you have any questions along the way during the webinar, please post them in the questions panel. I think it's on the right of your screen, and you can submit over there a question. We will be now switching over from our webcams to the slideshow so that there is full view for you guys to have a look on what's being presented. Mike, if you can move to the next slide, please. I don't see the next slide yet, Mike. Are you? I can still only see the first slide at the moment.
You should see part 1, the introduction.
No, that is not visible. That's now, yeah, I can see it now. Thank you very much. So on this slide, the content of this webinar is based on the deployment of a field area network. However, the steps included will be applicable to the rollout of any large communications network. So for part 1 of this 2-part topic that we are presenting, Mike will be covering the project charter and then moving on into the initiating phase and the planning phase of a fan project. But first, I will start with a brief introduction of Mimomax as a company and a short overview of a couple of our fan network deployments that Mimomax has been involved in. Thank you, Mike. So as you can see on the slide, Mimomax was founded 14 years ago in 2007. The founders of our company came out of the Advanced Wireless Research team at Tate Communications in Christchurch, New Zealand, and we are based on the same premises as Tate. The office is showing in the bottom photo of the screen. Our head office remains in Christchurch, but as we have rolled out more deployments across the US, we have opened offices here as well. We like to have an office close to major multi-deployment projects in order to have local staffing available to provide support. And so we have regional offices here in Phoenix, Arizona. A picture of that is at the top of the screen, as well as in Portland, Oregon. Our focus remains on providing mission-critical communication solutions for electric and water utilities, for public safety organizations, oil and gas, transport, and mining. So as mentioned before, the focus of this webinar is on field area networks. So I'll just give a quick overview of what a fan is and of the 2 fans that we are involved in that are at different stages of their deployment in North America at the moment. So to start, this slide summarizes, sorry, can you go back 1 slide, Mike? Thank you. This slide summarizes what a field area network is to ensure we're all talking the same language. As you see over here, the Mimomax vision of a fan is to enable pervasive monitoring, control, and seamless 2-way communications from the partner's core network to the edge of the local neighborhood. And the fan will become the backbone for all grid modernization efforts. And as you can see below there, there's a whole range of items that can be monitored and controlled through a fan. Next slide. Thank you, Mike. So the first fan I'll talk a bit about is Salt River Project here in Arizona. As the 3rd largest public utility, SRP is supplying over 1 million customers with power, water, and telecoms. The fan area covers the Phoenix metropolitan area plus a 13,000 square mile watershed. The SRP fan is being deployed and has been designed to provide visibility, monitoring, and control over a range of devices in their grid. Next slide, please, Mike. The fan is a two-tier fan. So at the tier 1 level, we have 48 3-sector base stations using our Tornado radios with redundancy built in via redundant radios and battery backup. And at this tier 1 level, the endpoint radios are connecting to our interrupters, DFA switches, and commercial solar. And the images there are from this deployment. Next slide. So at tier 2 level, we have our Pixis radios with over 1,200 base stations across the Phoenix Valley. And these are installed on light poles and capacitor banks. In terms of remote radios, eventually there will be thousands of these installed with the deployment underway currently. The remotes are installed at capacitor banks, Elster meter gatekeepers, and in the picture on the left, they're at residence for solar inverter communications. Moving on north from Arizona, we've got a large deployment in Oregon across a 3,800 square mile service area. And at a tier 1, the design allows for around 100 Tornado base stations with 40 25 kilohertz channels and multiple frequency use across the network. This slide here shows the range of applications which will eventually be supported by this fan, and which should give you a good idea on how many departments of a utility a field area network may touch, but also the variety of devices that will eventually be connected. Some of these devices are mission critical and require ultra latency, whereas others maybe simply be business critical and allow some flexibility in terms of latency and the regularity of polling. By designing a network with 2 tiers, the mission critical high data throughput devices can be supported at tier 1 with less critical assets, supported by the tier 2 of radios. So I'll hand over to Mike now to start breaking down our recommended steps for project managing a field area network. And the items are showing on the slide over there. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Fabian. As we mentioned, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. And in part 1, we will be covering the project charter, initiating the project, and planning the project. You may have noticed that I use the phrase key partners rather than key customers, clients, or accounts. This is because we view the relationship as a partnership rather than a traditional customer-vendor dynamic. We have found that the collaboration in the design, deployment, integration, and maintenance of a fan is optimal when a team approach is undertaken. Each member of the team or partnership has a purpose and a function that both supports and enhances the other team members. We do have a bit of a mixed group with us today, so I am starting with a brief overview of a project charter. As many of you will be aware, at the point where you kick off a project, it is recommended you create a project charter if one has not already been created for you. This document will outline the purpose and objectives of the project, any associated risks, who the stakeholders are, the budget involved, and the key benefits to be achieved. The project charter is created with the business case analysis and business management plan as its foundation. A project charter will normally include elements of the slide, such as a description of the project, which could consist of geographic territory the fan will encompass and the approximate number of endpoints. The fan providing the ability for the company to lay the foundation for its grid modernization plans could be listed as one of the business benefits. The deliverables such as the IP schema, RF design, training, and deployment of the base stations could be outlined. For the major milestones, items such as due diligence, bench testing, field testing, workshops could be listed as some of the major milestones. The due diligence effort will need to take place so that an estimated budget can be derived. The sponsors and key team members can also be outlined as part of the project charter. How do we start such a large project seemingly ambiguous? We have all heard the old adage that the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. It all starts with that first bite. Before you take that first bite, it will be important to perform a strategic analysis. This slide is an example of a 10-year strategic plan from one of our partners. It will be important to have a comprehensive understanding of what equipment can be monitored and controlled today, what equipment will have these capabilities in the future, and what equipment should have these capabilities. Once you have these assets identified, you can then begin to create a logical flow over time. As you begin to identify the stakeholders, the number of people will grow quickly. The stakeholders can be grouped into two general categories: the network development team and the internal customers. The network development team will consist of people such as the executive sponsor who created the business case analysis, benefit management plan, and quite often the project charter. It is the executive sponsor's vision that the project manager and project engineer and the network development team will work to bring to life. It is the procurement department that will most often facilitate the contract negotiations and associated service level agreements. Once the procurement department has completed their scope, we will then often be turned over to the purchasing department for quotes, purchase orders, and invoicing. As a project manager, the two people that I work most closely with are the partner's project manager and project engineer, and I typically work with them on a daily basis. Many of our partnering utilities have a standards department that will document how the radios will be mounted, grounded, and powered at each of the various assets that will be connected to the network. When it comes to the Tier 1 and Tier 2 base stations, our partner will often elect to subcontract the construction work to a local contractor. The local contractor will also often be contracted to perform the cabinet and antenna line installations. When it comes to the equipment installation, we have seen both self-perform and subcontract models utilized. Integrations are almost always exclusively performed by the partner's field technicians in conjunction with their operations center. The Network Operations Center is most often the entity that will be responsible for monitoring the health of the network and issuing any trouble tickets to the maintenance technicians. The maintenance department will troubleshoot any trouble ticket as well as perform preventative maintenance as needed. In the initial development of the IP requirements, the cybersecurity department will be heavily involved. Often when a new asset class is put on the network for the first time, the cybersecurity department will be involved with firewall changes. You will find that the stakeholders involved will be a small core of team members that have the primary responsibility of working together on a daily basis and build the network backbone that the internal customers will use. From the strategic plan, we can begin to identify our internal customers. We have found that the internal customer groups are often quite siloed and they normally do not have much interaction with each other. As you will see in the workshop slides, it is very important to identify the stakeholders for each of the network user groups. Our utility partner's project manager and project engineer will normally be the primary points of contact for these internal customers. The project manager will need to work with the individual internal customers as well as the standards group to identify and document how the radios will be integrated into the equipment that is to be monitored. There will also be a number of external stakeholders that will need to be identified, as the network development team will need to work with a contingent of selected partners to help plan, design, and deploy the network. The selected partners should be experienced in narrowband communications with a solid understanding of the requirements needed to deploy a wireless, mission-critical Internet of Things network. Depending on the vendor you choose, they may do one or multiple of these items. With Mimomax as a partner, we will be able to manufacture the radios, manufacture the antennas, provide the RF network design engineering, perform the drive testing, and aid in selecting and coordinating with a spectrum vendor as well as a network management vendor. In some instances, we have been asked by our partners to go a step further and assist with the spectrum purchase, perform FCC licensing, manufacture and integrate the base station cabinets, perform the cabinet and equipment rack installations, perform the antenna line installations, integrate the new radio into the network, and perform end-to-end quality testing. Organizing and streamlining the network deployment team with clear duties and responsibilities is an important task. Mimomax typically sits in the lower portion of the hierarchy and will provide much of the foundational work and services on which the fan will be built. As a project manager, scope, schedule, and budget are the triple constraints which ultimately determine quality. Budget often creates a strain on the number of resources that can be dedicated or assigned to the project. This resource constraint makes organizing and communications the linchpins of a successful deployment. At Mimomax, we have a philosophy of becoming one enthusiastic team by building enduring partner relationships, which are achieved by having a passion to innovate, being obsessed with quality, and looking beyond the commercial outcome. Our solution engineers use these values to help us bridge the stakeholder gap by bringing a wealth of lessons learned and mission-critical IoT understanding to the workshop events. These workshops allow us to custom tailor a network to your specific needs and provide working solutions to seemingly insurmountable obstacles. From our perspective, a huge contributor to the success of any major deployment project is ensuring that you can develop a strong partnership with the vendor you select. These projects typically roll out over a 5 to 10 year period. That's a long time to be working alongside a vendor, so ensuring you have a clear cultural fit, a desire to work together as partners, and clear lines of communications are paramount. In any project of this scale, there will be challenges to overcome and milestones to celebrate. This is not a simple out-of-the-box purchase, so the relationships between your team and the vendor team needs to be strong and characterized by shared goals. Due to budget constraints and the temporary nature of some of the staffing requirements, many of our partners have asked us to provide staff augmentation services, which have lasted anywhere from several months to several years. Once the augmentation has been completed, the personnel are reabsorbed back into the Mimomax organization, where the experiences and lessons learned are shared amongst their fellow team members. An example of this type of augmentation has taken place with the fan deployment that kicked off in 2017. As we moved into the Tier 1 base station deployment phase, we were asked to provide some staff augmentations. One augmentation was a field engineer who specialized in RF troubleshooting, and another was a customer support engineer who worked in the back office with the project engineer. The field engineer engagement lasted for 2 years, and the customer support engineer is still embedded to this day. A shorter engagement with the same partner was affectionately known as the SRP Squared program. We provided engineers from our corporate office in Christchurch, New Zealand, on 6 to 8 week rotations for a period of 12 months. These engineers represented staff from our software development, hardware development, operations, and customer support teams. While providing a valuable technical resource to our partner, it also allowed the opportunity for our engineers to have a quote-unquote customer experience, where they learned firsthand some of the challenges that our partners are faced with. Mimomax found this experience to be very valuable as it allows us to provide a better partner experience through understanding and empathy. Planning to take that first bite of the elephant? Where should you start that first bite from? The front or the back, the top or the bottom? Any large deployment project can seem a little fuzzy in the beginning. Creating a roadmap will help the project manager to bring focus. Workshops are a great tool that can help bring focus to the requirements and priorities. In our past deployments, we have found that building on lessons learned has allowed us to help our partners fast track their road mapping efforts. As previously mentioned, due diligence will often occur prior to the creation of the project charter. As we previously mentioned, scope, schedule, and budget are always the triple constraints. Budget and resource constraints can be softened through a thorough due diligence effort. The due diligence effort will also establish the foundation for a successful Public Utility Commission filing. These due diligence efforts will also help provide the information that may be needed for any other federally funded project, such as grid modernization or infrastructure improvements. We have worked with several of our partners to create a preliminary RF coverage design to help determine the number of Tier 1 base stations that would be needed to provide coverage in their area of interest and accommodate an estimated number of endpoint radios. From this preliminary design effort, we can then begin to extrapolate the estimated number of resources that will be required for the planning, execution, monitoring and controlling, and closing phases of the project. We will then apply the equipment and resources cost over the expected deployment timeline. The final output is a total estimated network deployment cost, which follows a typical S-curve pattern. These early efforts have been instrumental in helping our partners with their PUC funding efforts. We have found that working with our partners through bench testing and turning that bench test into functional labs will give them insights into the performance and capabilities that our radios have to offer. After the bench testing has been completed, a field trial is often performed to allow for a real-world operational experience. We have found that many of the network internal customers do not have an understanding of their equipment data requirements, and from a fear of missing out, they default to a standard fiber throughput capability, even if these capabilities aren't required. While these requested capabilities provide a buffer for their lack of understanding, it is not realistic when dealing with a narrowband wireless network. For a deployment, the project manager and project engineer will need to work with their internal customers to derive a rough order of magnitude information base. This process can take several months due to the equipment owner's sparse knowledge of their own needs. One such internal customer had a new piece of equipment, and once it was placed in the lab, they found that the equipment provided for 192 different attributes to be pulled every second. When the equipment was when we tried to run the equipment with these attributes and these throughputs, it was found to be impossible. After working with the internal customer, it was ultimately determined that they only needed to pull 10 attributes every 15 minutes. Our workshops are designed to engineer out and eliminate these types of situations. Workshops allow us to build an understanding of the internal customer's needs and requirements, both the equipment requirements and the human requirements. These workshops are also an opportunity for the various departments of the utility to gain an understanding of the capabilities of the fan. At Mimomax, our project manager works closely with our partner PM and PE to organize these information gathering workshops. It is important to provide an easy way for attendees to contribute, especially if there are internal politics which might make open responses difficult. By hosting a series of IP workshops with the various network users, we can begin to unlock and look into the actual data requirements which may influence the RF design. Latency requirements, data type, bandwidth requirements, and packet size with required intervals are some of the primary drivers for the network architecture and IP schema. Once the IP workshop has been completed, you can then have an understanding of the total network requirements. This slide shows an example of bandwidth requirements for one of our field area networks. The assumption might have been that fiber was needed to support all of these applications. However, after gathering the key data points on all the network devices in the IP workshop, it was clear that a sophisticated network design with frequency reuse plan could support this level of bandwidth. From a hardware perspective, once we know the internal customer's data requirements, we can then begin to design the RF. From an IP network perspective, it should be noted that each different internal customer can be assigned a different virtual local area network, or VLAN. These individual VLANs allow the customer's traffic to be segregated and secured so that another internal customer cannot observe or access the data. We provide Q&Q, which allows the customer data packets to be tagged and routed to the proper VLAN. Traffic prioritization can be achieved by assigning each customer a different quality of service setting. After the IP workshop has been completed, the RF workshop can then be held. A primary point of interest is identifying which of our partners' assets can be utilized for base station co-locations. The output of the RF engineering effort will dictate the scope of work required for the network deployment and will have a direct impact on the scope of work. Asset utilization for base station co-location will dictate the amount of site acquisition and permitting needed, which will have a direct impact on the deployment schedule. Less site acquisition and less permitting equals less civil construction, which translates into fewer resources needed and a quicker network deployment while conserving the budget. The output of the RF workshop will be the RF plan, which will include the channel plan, the channel reuse plan, the number, configuration, and location of the Tier 1 base stations, the number and location of the Tier 1 endpoints, the 5 best servers for each Tier 1 endpoint, the number, configuration, and location for each Tier 2 base station, and the number and location for each Tier 2 endpoint. The IP and RF workshops will allow us to determine the best type of network architecture to apply so that we can tailor a network that will meet our partner's specific needs. As a project manager, you will want to have a high-level understanding of how and why the network was designed in a specific fashion. This image illustrates a Tier 1 endpoint wirelessly connected to a Tier 1 base station, which has cloud access. The Tier 1 base station is typically 3 sectors, but can also be an omni. The two-tier design allows for many times more endpoints to be connected at a lower price point. As previously discussed, the IP workshop is instrumental in identifying the latency, bandwidth, and radio requirements. As you can see, the network will grow quickly, and a network management system will become instrumental in organizing the radios and data. You can see here that as the network grows and the number of Tier 1 base stations, associated Tier 2 base stations, and Tier 2 endpoints grows, the network will grow quite rapidly. As a PM, you will need to work with your PE to determine which network management system will be used and what the use requirements are. Your radio vendor should be able to provide a considerable number of MIBs, which can be utilized by any NMS. A MIB is a management information base, which is a database used for managing the entities in a communications network, most often associated with Simple Network Management Protocol, or SNMP. Ultimately, the NMS is important to the operations and maintenance personnel so that they can monitor the health of the network and the key performance indicators. By monitoring the KPIs and operations, the team can see if any degradations are taking place and initiate preventative troubleshooting. The NMS will also allow for the capacity of an individual Tier 1 or Tier 2 base station to be monitored. This capacity monitoring will act as a leading indicator and allow time for the network to be expanded with the new base station installation prior to the network traffic starting to block. Mimomax has worked extensively with Managed Engine to customize their Op Manager NMS to work with our Tornado and Pixis radios. One feature that we have developed with them is the auto discovery feature. When a radio is energized, it will seek a network connection and auto-populate its geographic location and name on the overview map. From a PM perspective, Op Manager allows for easy customization with friendly user graphics. One of the main dashboards that our engineers will use for a quick overview of the network is the map. The map view will allow an at-a-glance overview of the network's health. From here, you can hover your cursor over a site icon for a specific site, gather its information, and then drill down for more information and details. Any NMS that is considered should be fully FCAPS compliant, which will provide fault, configuration, accounting, performance, and security information. As a PM, you should consider how the network will be maintained. One aspect of this is the need for periodic firmware or encryption key upgrades. Mimomax achieves this through its CNMS. CNMS is a complementary network management system. It provides over-the-air programming for firmware upgrades, as well as over-the-air rekeying for encryption key upgrades and updates. Creating a training plan to meet the human needs will be required. We have found that an individual fan technology and capabilities overview to a large crowd consisting of all stakeholders can be beneficial in establishing a baseline understanding of the technology and purpose, as well as getting their excitement levels up. We then provide targeted training to specific groups to strengthen the knowledge that they will need to fulfill their functions. As the project manager, you need to be aware that if this training is given too early, the information could become fuzzy or forgotten. Conversely, if the training is given too late, unneeded frustrations and aggravations can be experienced as users have wasted time trying to teach themselves the system. With the strategic plan understood, the size and scope of the fan defined, the fan project roadmap can then be created. Typically, this is a high-level overview that will show all the major milestones for each year. We will be taking a much deeper dive into this in part 2. With the fan project roadmap created, it will then be possible to create an annual budget based on the anticipated activities. We have found that working as partners to determine the deployment roadmap and creating quotes on an annual allotment has helped to reduce possible friction in the purchasing and manufacturing supply chains. The typical fan will take multiple years to deploy all of the base stations and endpoint radios. As the fans grow, each base station can be utilized by the assets radio endpoints within its radius. With the fan deployment duration identified and the equipment needs for each year known, each year the deployment can then be budgeted, a quote provided, and a PO issued. With the issuance of an annual purchase order, it will allow us to prime the manufacturing supply chain, schedule delivery over the course of the year, and take advantage of equipment price breaks. This slide concludes part 1 of the Project Management for Field Area Networks webinar. I will now turn it back over to Fabian.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the explanation on those process steps. So before we move over to the questions, I just want to point out that there are some handouts available off to the right of your screen that you can download. And if you want to, please do so before the end of the webinar. Mike, if you can move to the next section or next slides, please. Thank you. So one last item before we move on to the questions which have been sent through. I'll just highlight here the topics which will be included in the second webinar on this subject, and that will take place on September 23rd. The focus of that webinar will be around executing the project, monitoring and control of the fan project, and lastly, closing a fan project. We will be sending out the invite for this webinar in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for your inbox for that invitation. Lastly, before we move on to those questions, if you are attending the UTC event in Portland next week, this is just a reminder to stop by our booth to meet our team for a chat and to talk about our solutions, hardware and services wise, that we designed for utilities and other customers. You'll find us at booth 865, and our CEO, sales team, and myself will be there to provide any further information to interested parties, or if you have any questions that you would like to ask in person. So finally, before going to those questions that have come through during my presentation, if you have a question you'd like to ask, again, take a look at the right panel where there is a questions box that you can submit your questions into. And we'll have a little bit of time left over, it looks like, to go through some questions. So yeah, Mike, let's see. I've got some questions over here. Question number one that I've got is of the stakeholder slide, which one of the stakeholders on that slide, which one do you typically work with most closely?
I work most closely with the project manager and project engineer. So I tend to work with them on a weekly basis, if not more. During the initial phases of the fan with one of our customers, I was actually embedded in their office 3 days a week. So I was working quite closely with the project manager and project engineer to make sure that everything was getting kicked off and identified properly.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Another question that's been asked: how long does the whole due diligence phase normally take?
That's actually a really good question. The due diligence normally takes place prior to the or in conjunction with the benefits case analysis and the benefits management plan. It can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on how aggressively the executive doing that work and how much time they have to pursue it. Once the paperwork has been created, it can take several months of back and forth questions and answers between the PUC and the utility to get everything, all the questions answered and all the details ironed out. And again, we've worked with our partners in the past to perform some of those preliminary RF designs, equipment estimates, labor estimates, and help spread those out over the anticipated deployment period so that we can provide a fairly good look at what all's involved and what all the costs are going to be from both a hardware and human resource aspect. I think you're on mute there, Fabian.
My apologies, Mike. Another question that I see on the screen over here: what information is needed to do a preliminary RF design?
Generally, to perform a preliminary RF design, we're going to need to know the geographic area that they want the fan to cover. In RF engineering terms, they refer to that as the polygon. And then along with that, we'll need to know the time and availability requirements for the radios, the desired modulation levels they want those radios to be working at, and then also the locations and antenna heights for any of the possible tier 1 base stations that we can utilize. Something else that we'll also need to perform that preliminary design is the estimated number of endpoints that we need to account for. For the final design, there's also some additional information around the endpoint locations, antenna heights, latency requirements, packet size, and transmission intervals, which we already spoke about. We will be getting into the RF engineering design quite a bit more in part 2 of our webinar.
Okay. Another question over here. How many training sessions in total do you normally need to hold during a deployment?
This really depends on the partner, on our partner and their internal organization requirements. Often the training can be broken down into several sections. As mentioned, the first section for a larger group of all the stakeholders generally gives them an idea of what the fan can do, and it helps them to have a preliminary understanding of all the capabilities and what else they can do other than what they had been doing or had been thinking of. The internal users, so each group that will have equipment riding the fan, we typically have a training session for them, and that again will occur after the IP network workshop or the IP workshops. Those IP workshops allow us to define how the data is going to ride the network, how it's generated at the far end, how it transitions the network, and where it ends up sitting in their database. So we will typically have a internal users group for those internal users. And then we also typically have a workshop or a training session for the network engineering group. So the network engineering group, they're going to be building the fan, so they need to have a slightly different understanding than what the internal users might have. Also, the technicians in operations, they're more concerned with maintaining and troubleshooting versus just how their data is transferring over the fan or how the fan is built. So I would say there's 5 primary training sessions that we typically do with our customers.
Okay, thank you for that. There's one that came through that I might be able to answer myself. So what's the warranty period on Mimomax hardware? And so we've got 15 months factory warranty. That's standard on our radios. And then there's an option as well to take extended warranty. And that can be discussed as per requirements from any end users or customers that are looking for a longer term warranty period rather than the standard 15-month warranty on our radios. Another question mark that came through is around budgets. How do you ensure budget don't blow out when dealing with such long deployment? As you mentioned, there can be many years for that deployment to continue.
That's a trick question and a tough question. The easy answer is to make sure that contingency and management reserves are built into the budget originally. The tough answer is that in the due diligence stage, it's very important not to underestimate the level of effort that will be required to build a private communications network. Trying to use as many existing assets as possible will save on the construction costs as well as the operating capital expenses. So if you utilize your own assets, you don't have to pay rent. Some customers, some partners utilize assets by third parties such as Crown Castle or American Tower, where they have monthly rental that they have to pay to those companies. And they normally have their own processes, which can also drag out the deployment period. Also using existing structures, as we discussed, will reduce the amount of construction and permits and A&E fees. If some of our potential partners, have union affiliations, If there are unions involved, I would recommend taking advantage of of Mimomax's ability to provide a external base station cabinet or any internal equipment rack, which can be ordered as a single SKU item. And then also take advantage of our staff augmentation when available. Much of the labor requirements are temporary in nature, so rather than hiring staff and having to take on that additional overhead, we can provide staff augmentation services, and then once those staff members are no longer needed, they're reabsorbed back into the Mimomax team. For us, those staff augmentation people are not disposable. They are full-time personnel in Mimomax, and they are experts in what they do. I would also say that a big thing is to make sure that your project manager and project engineer are in unison. You know, if they're in lockstep with regards to scope, purpose, thought, and intent, these two people can divide and conquer and cover a lot of ground very quickly. One last item would be, I know that we offer the purchase of the equipment in several different ways. Most often the customers will do an annual purchase, which allows them to utilize some of our price breaks. We've also had customers that did the full purchase with one PO, which allowed them to achieve the full benefit of all the price breaks, and then we spread those deliveries out over 4 or 5 years. I would also say that if they don't take advantage of that large price break and they're going to do annual incremental budgets, they might also want to take into account the consumer price index as year over year, the cost of gas and the cost of labor does go up. So that price indexing should be taken into account over the 5 or 10 year period.
Very good points, Mike. Thank you very much for answering those questions. We are sitting exactly on the top of the hour, so we'll be finishing off this webinar. If you have any further questions, as I said, we are at UTC next week. If you would be attending that, otherwise you can send us an email on support@mimomax.com or reach out to your local sales manager from Mimomax if you have any contact details from them. Again, we hope to see you again towards the end of September for the second part of this webinar. And I hope we've been able to give you some useful information to take back to your organization for a potential fan rollout of your own. Thank you very much and have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.